Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
From her rich and fertile valleys to the shores of her icy seas, from her fields and farms and shellfish beds and her many nurseries, for the finest of her flavor, for the freshest by far, choose the things Alaskans bring to the market where you are. Products that we're proud to call our own, and it's all Alaska grown.
The National Weather Service.
And good Thursday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service on this 18th of August. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your local weather information. You can find that at weather.gov/Alaska, or if you'd like to localize your information, you can go from that webpage or start at weather.gov/Fairbanks or /Anchorage or /Juneau. That'll get you into your part of Alaska that you're most concerned with. From there, it's pretty easy to find your local forecast. A click on the map will take you to your pinpoint forecast that is much more localized than it used to be. It'll give you a lot more detail and probably a lot more precision in the information you're looking for, as well as linking you up with your nearest forecast observation. However, if you're looking at the website and the weather information from perhaps a slower connection speed, whether that's on cell phone or on land-based internet, we do have some better options for you. And if you haven't found those yet, please let us know at nws.ar.tvweather@noaa.gov or david.snyder@noaa.gov will get directly to me as well. I'll be happy to guide you to your local connections so you can stay connected with the National Weather Service on our website. Now, social media is always a great place to go. Twitter, Facebook, and of course on YouTube. We'll give you your daily afternoon map briefing around 4 o'clock. If you listened to that earlier today, you probably heard me tell you a little bit more about some of the rainfall we're expecting, not in just one spot, but probably two regions. In the central northern sections of Southeast gearing up for some wetter weather, but the really big focus for persistent wet weather seems to be in the central and western parts of the Brooks Range, and that could drain into the upper Kobuk and Noatak valleys and even lower. So it could bring some flooding to the region. We're going to keep an eye on that, a very slow-moving system there. With persistent southwesterly winds, we have moisture working its way up into the higher terrain, and when that happens, it condenses that moisture. It literally gets wrung out of the atmosphere and falls down. And in those valleys, we expect a decent amount of runoff there. There are no watches, warnings, or advisories or anything like that at this time. But it's worth considering, though, if you're going out to do some hunting or perhaps you're still working on the berries, we are expecting a pretty persistent wet weather period here. That could mean that your road or your trail could become flooded after you pass over it the first time. So when you come back, conditions might be a little bit different there. And of course, you're tired, you're ready to get home and rest. You need to think carefully about crossing those flooded streams, trails, and roads there. If there is water on your road or trail, make sure you consider very carefully what you're about to do, as flooding is the #1 weather-related killer in our country. That includes Alaska. So make sure that you're being extra careful. Never cross a flooded trail or a roadway there. Just a little bit of water can sweep you and your vehicle away. It doesn't take a whole lot of water to do it. Water is one of the most powerful forces on our planet there, as you well know. Here's a look at Southeast, and you can see there we're also watching for some slightly more moderate rainfall across the central and northern parts of Southeast. We've been tapering these forecasts back just a little bit there, so it may not be quite as heavy as what you see at this point. 1 to 2 inches of rain possible in some of the higher terrain there, but the big overall factor is this stream of moisture that's stretching all the way from the subtropics and running into Alaska. It's a pretty common experience as we get into very late summer and all the way into early winter. So we call this an atmospheric river. Perhaps you've heard of that term before. What it literally is a river of moisture, a channel or a corridor where moisture is pulled all the way up across the subtropics through the mid-latitudes and into Alaska or other parts of the country or world for that matter. And once it reaches land, it has a much greater potential of creating localized heavy rainfall and therefore localized higher streams or rivers or even flooding there. So this would be a piece of that atmospheric river. It doesn't look like it's going to be nearly as intense as some of them have been. Certainly in the last couple of years we've had our taste of atmospheric river events. What we're seeing out across western Alaska in the northern parts of the Brooks Range, or the western Brooks Range anyway, isn't necessarily an atmospheric river as much as it is just a very slow moving weather system that has a lot of moisture to work with. It has a lot more fanned out, let's say, and a persistent southwesterly flow that is reaching into the higher terrain, and that orographic lift, or that air running into the mountains and being lifted mechanically by the terrain itself, is wringing out the moisture. So two different processes going on today in our weather around Alaska. You get a slightly better view of that channel of moisture here that's worked its way all the way up from the subtropics. Think Hawaii, that kind of warm and wet air all the way up into the Gulf of Alaska. Not unusual, certainly this time of the year, not unusual at all, but something that we have to pay very close attention to about where it's going. Think of it kind of like a fire hose, and that fire hose aimed right up here at the northern Gulf, and it will slowly fire hose itself over here into the central and northern parts of southeast as we get through the remainder of the week. You can see low pressure here. That is one of the pumps for the moisture, working that moisture up from the Gulf of Alaska and guiding that in from the southwest to northeast into the parts of the panhandle there. Clouds across south central and southwest have had some rainfall in it today. Expect more of that to come in the coming days. And you can also see the overall weather pattern guiding moisture up into north and western Alaska. As we look at the jet stream, watch for a very large trough, a large area of low pressure carved out right here across the Bering Sea. And it's that southwesterly flow again in the upper atmosphere guiding moisture into northern and western sections of Alaska today. So one more time in the satellite loop, you can see that downward motion out across the western Bering, the southwesterly motion into northern parts of Alaska, and then we have that atmospheric river here across northern parts of southeast. Pretty impressive stuff. Always something interesting going on around Alaska. Here is the surface chart where the rubber meets the road, and high pressure sitting across the northern part of Cook Inlet at 1,023 millibars, trying to hold back the secluded front from working itself northward. Not that we'd see a whole lot of changes with that, but probably more clouds, maybe a few showers. The focus for wet weather, at least around the Gulf of Alaska, is going to be in southeast now, as that wave of moisture is working its way eastward. There's also some fog involved in that as well. You've probably seen that in many parts of northern southeast earlier today. Out across the west, a very weak area of high pressure sitting across the central chain. Some light rainfall there, out across Adak and maybe westward toward Kiska. And then we get back into that wetter pattern up north. A cold front is working its way onto the Chukchi coast with that rain and fog. And it looks like that's going to be the pattern for the next 24 to 48 hours. High pressure sitting right along the Chukchi coast will push that front up toward the Brooks Range summits and almost to Kaktovik. So expect some cooler, wetter, cloudier, foggier weather for most North Slope communities into Kotzebue Sound. But just south of that, we've got a little bit more of a southwesterly flow, and so this hasn't gone away yet. If you're on a southwest facing coast, you're probably going to see higher than normal surf conditions. We don't have any warnings yet. No coastal flood advisories there, but things could be a little bit choppy. So if you haven't brought things in from the coast just yet and you're on a southwest facing coast up around northwestern Alaska, you might want to keep a watch on that. As we get into Friday, that front moves northward again because the southwesterlies pick up. The winds should come back up, and that's going to keep rainfall focused at the higher terrain across the western Brooks Range. That means more rain for the Kobuk and Noatak valleys. It could be about 2 to 4 inches of rain in some cases there, and all that's going to drain back down toward Kotzebue Sound and the lower terrain there. So if you're on the Kobuk or Noatak rivers, you want to keep an eye on how high they're getting, and if you're camped out pretty close, you might want to take a few steps back at very least. Keep a watch on that. The winds will stay with us, and you'll notice that front never really clears the northern coast. That's going to keep fog and light rainfall focused very close to many of the communities there. Light rainfall will continue around the Gulf of Alaska and out across the YK Delta. Another surge of moisture will work its way around that southern part of the storm system. Now, the storm itself is not terribly strong, but it is a very good pump of moisture working across the southern Bering, and each one of these lines, a trough of low pressure, is just a little kind of a kick to get those clouds building. So waves of rain working in across the southern Bering, And up around the north, that little pink area I've shaded in here, that could be cold enough for a rain and snow mix across western sections of the Brooks Range. So don't be real surprised if you see a few snowflakes mixing in with what should be mostly rain at higher terrain. So a lot going on there, and we're still watching the sea ice as well across the north slope, watching for those northerly winds. This is a good pattern there as high pressure setting up here. Looks like we could have a little bit more of a northerly push around Point Barrow. So we'll keep watch on that, as well as heavier rain showers on Saturday for central and northern parts of southeast. Looks like south central could see a little bit of a break to start the weekend, but obviously there's rain back behind that. Here's a look at temperatures today. 50s and 60s for a good chunk of southeast. We even saw a few places like St. Mary's Island poke its way up into the 80-degree range today. Wow. 56 around Juneau, 61 around Skagway, 57 for Haines. Prince William Sound saw temps in the 50s and 60s today. Cordova, pleasant 66, 64 here in Anchorage, 67 in Talkeetna. Fairbanks had 68 degrees, 71 in Eagle, 63 in Northway. Fort Yukon, a pleasant and warm 72, 53 in Kaktovik. Down the coast we go toward Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse, 50s and 60s there. Barrow was 44, Atkasuk 51. Wainwright had temps in the upper 40s this afternoon. Kivalina was 52, Kotzebue 70, Shishmaref 54 there for our friends, on 54 in Nome as well. Savunga had 48 degrees. Galena, a very mild 68. Tanana was 69. About the same there as McGrath, 64 in Grayling, 65 in Bethel. And Bristol Bay temperatures were generally in the 50s around the Cape, 64 around King Salmon. Lake Iliamna milder still, 62 in Kodiak, 50s and 60s for a large part of the Alaska Peninsula, 57 in Sand Point and around False Pass, 54 for St. Paul, about the same there for Adak, Atka, and Shemya, only 51. Overnight low temperatures will stay in the lower to mid 50s for southeast, south central closer to that 50-degree mark. Kodiak 53, the Copper River Basin cooling into the 40s. Around the Tanana Valley, 53 in Fairbanks, a little bit cooler down toward Tanana itself, 46 in Eagle, 47 in Arctic Village, and still above freezing for the North Slope. 34 in Barrow, 37 in Wainwright, Kaktovik 43, Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse, our friends there at 44, 51 around Nome, 55 for Kotzebue, lower 50s for St. Lawrence Island, and mid 50s as you get out toward the Yukon and Kuskokwim deltas there, probably about 53 in Bethel. Bristol Bay temperatures back in the mid-50s, and most of the chain in the upper 40s and lower 50s. St. Paul 50 degrees, a high 56 tomorrow. The Yukon Valley anywhere from 60 degrees out toward the Delta to the upper 60s up toward Fort Yukon and Eagle. And as you get into the 40s and 50s for the North Slope, you'll see milder weather around some of the higher terrain, but watch out for areas around this upper Kobuk and Noatak valleys again. A little bit cooler weather up there with persistent rainfall expected. 61 around Kotzebue, south central, looking at highs in the low to mid 60s tomorrow. Prince William Sound, low 60s for you, upper 50s and lower 60s for southeast with Ketchikan and Annette, and well, let's say places down toward Craig and Klawock. Some of the warmest weather, at least along coastal parts of Alaska. The chain back in the lower to mid 50s tomorrow. On to flying weather. IFR conditions will stretch along that ribbon of moisture stretching in through the Bering and across the North Slope, as well as parts of south central and the Alaska Peninsula tomorrow. MVFR conditions to start in southeast, but watch what happens there. IFR develops south of Sitka toward the Dixon entrance by the afternoon. There's an isolated chance for a storm or two around the upper 40-mile country as well as the upper Yukon Valley. And IFR conditions are going to move in even more for the North Slope as well as part of Kotzebue Sound, the western end of the Seward Peninsula, and a large area of the Bering Sea, not to mention hit and miss IFR across the western Gulf and south of Kodiak Island. What about the pass conditions? Anaktuvik and Adigan Pass probably holding at or about MVFR through a large part of the day, so probably what you'd expect with rainfall moving in. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass should see some improvements, though we may have a start out at IFR in the morning there, so keep watch on that. Rainy Pass looks like we'll see a lot more improvement in that region for visibility and sealing. VFR conditions are expected late in the day. Windy Pass expecting to see improvements from a start at MVFR for your Friday. Isabel Pass we expect to see VFR conditions developing throughout the day. Metasta Pass looks pretty good, but watch for afternoon convection to be possible in the region there. A storm cloud could develop. Tanita Pass, probably IFR to start the day, but it could see some pretty significant improvement throughout the afternoon. And Portage Pass, we expect to see improvements up to MVFR on the eastern side. Rainfall will still keep things down for a good part of Prince William Sound, so watch yourself there. And for Chilkoot and White Pass, lingering at MVFR through most of the day. IFR conditions again developing much further south across the Panhandle. Freezing levels show that cold air aloft is trying as hard as it can to drop into Alaska. Not just yet. We're not ready for winter. 4, 6, and 8,000 foot levels there across the North Slope, and you can see that colder air is dropped all the way down toward the Alaska Peninsula. But there is much warmer air across the eastern Gulf at 14,000 feet and also across the western Bering above 14,000 feet. So quite a change from west to east and north to south tomorrow morning. Above 9,000 feet across the North Slope, though, there is plenty of moisture there, and you're going to find a elevated risk of icing as we go ahead through the weekend. It looks like light to isolated moderate possible across the North Slope and Kotzebue Sound, as well as northern parts of the Gulf and over southeastern Alaska, where we start to get a lot of that cooling shaping up there with low pressure systems working significant moisture into southeast and across the western parts of the Brooks Range tomorrow. Here's the jet stream. Remember what I said to watch for? That big trough. Well, we've got a piece of it right here across the Bering driving those northerlies out into the Pacific, but then the return side of that is that moisture pump that is feeding that atmospheric river, the corridor of moisture pointed right at southeastern Alaska. So what's going on over here? Well, we have West Pacific moisture that's made its way across eastern Asia and Russia and made its way into the Arctic jet, and that is feeding its way into the western part of the Brooks Range. So a lot of things going on here to feed moisture into Alaska, a pretty typical occurrence for this time of the year. As we get into 9,000 feet, here are those westerly winds anywhere from 30 to 40 knots right into the western and central Brooks Range there. Southwesterlies across the Gulf of Alaska between 25 and 40 knots. And you can see winds have picked up across the interior, 20 to 30 from the southwest tomorrow at 9,000 feet. More of a westerly flow for a good chunk of the Aleutians tomorrow. And low pressure still sitting very close to Sand Point, a little bit further to the west at 3,000 feet. Wind speeds here pretty consistent with what we saw a moment ago, 25 to 40 across the interior and the west coast. Across the North Slope, 30 and 40 knot winds across, let's say, Kotzebue Sound up toward Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse. You can see winds are considerably lighter here on the north side of high pressure across the eastern Gulf of Alaska. So what about turbulence? Well, over the Brooks Range tomorrow out toward Point Hope and Point Lay, Seward Peninsula, the Bering Strait, and way out west across Shemya there, and even further west than Shemya, I should say, the Kuril Islands. Let's check turbulence there, probably below about 4,000 feet right now, southeast, south central, and a good chunk of the interior look to be A-OK. That's a look at your aviation forecast. I'll be back with your marine weather and sea ice updates here in just a few minutes.
Venus and Jupiter meet again.
Welcome to Stargazers. I'm Dean Regas, astronomer from the Cincinnati Observatory.
And I'm James Albury, director of the Kika Silva Pla Planetarium in Gainesville, Florida. Last summer, Venus and Jupiter lined up in such a way that they performed a super scoochie in the evening sky as viewed from Earth.
Now, the official astronomical term for a planetary scoochie is a conjunction. And if you happen to be a fan of planetary conjunctions like James, you're going to be really happy on August 27th.
That's right, Dean. Venus is back in the evening sky, and it will have another super-duper close rendezvous with Jupiter. This pairing will be so close that Jupiter and Venus will be less than a full moon width apart right after sunset.
What are we talking about, and how does it all work? Let's show you.
As many of you know, the planets orbit the sun in nested ellipses. When we view the solar system from above, the planets look like runners on a racetrack with each planet in a different lane. Mercury being the closest planet to the sun, then Venus, then Earth, and then Mars, and so on.
As we travel around the sun, we're all traveling at different speeds. The astronomer Johannes Kepler noticed that planets closer to the sun travel faster than those farther away. For example, it takes Mercury only 88 Earth days to orbit the sun, moving at a brisk 106,000 miles per hour. Venus, by comparison, takes 225 days to orbit the sun, moving at a slower 78,000 miles per hour.
Earth takes roughly 365 days to orbit the sun, traveling approximately 66,000 miles per hour. Meanwhile, Mars takes almost 2 years to orbit the sun. On average, Mars is traveling about 54,000 miles per hour, dragging its two moons, Phobos and Deimos, along with it.
As we get further from the sun, Kepler's observations of planetary motion still hold true.
Jupiter takes almost 12 years to orbit the Sun, traveling at a pokey 29,000 miles per hour. Jupiter was at its closest approach to Earth this year back in early February. Since that time, Earth has traveled over 237 million miles, leaving Jupiter behind.
Venus, which is traveling faster than the Earth, has rounded the Sun and is now emerging from behind the Sun. As it travels, it will appear along our line of sight with respect to Jupiter.
And this is what causes a conjunction. Now you're probably asking yourself, why don't Venus and Jupiter get super close every year? Let's show you.
Not only are the orbits of planets nested ellipses, they're also inclined to each other. In other words, the orbits, although they appear flat, all vary in their tilt slightly.
We call the tilt of a planet's orbit its orbital inclination. It's the variation in each planet's orbital inclination and the timing of planetary passages that makes some conjunctions closer than others.
Venus and Jupiter usually have a conjunction every year, and they can put on quite a show. For example, in July 2012, Venus and Jupiter had a close conjunction in the constellation Taurus the Bull just before sunrise on July 15th.
Then in May 2013, Venus and Jupiter had an even closer conjunction and were joined by Mercury on the evening of May 28th.
Then in August 2014, Venus and Jupiter had an impressively close conjunction in the pre-dawn sky on August 18th.
If you notice, there's a pattern here. Each year, we alternate between morning conjunctions and evening conjunctions. That's because every 9 months, Venus alternates between being on the eastern side of the Sun, where it's visible just after sunset, and we call it the evening star.
And then Venus passes the Earth, is caught in the glare of the Sun for about a week, and then reappears on the western side of the Sun, where it's visible before the Sun rises. In this position, we call Venus the morning star.
So, as you probably guessed, Venus is currently in its evening star position. And after sunset on August 27th, we'll experience one of the closest Venus-Jupiter conjunctions humans have seen in a long time. So, mark your calendars.
And if you have clear skies, you can see it for yourself. Keep looking up.
As a weather disturbance banks its way up toward the Brooks Range, that's going to allow more northerly winds to set in across the North Slope. And with pack ice and concentrations above 80% here, that could bring more ice down toward the coast. So we're watching that very carefully. And for any updates on concentration and thickness, sea surface temperatures, and more, you can get that forecast out to 5 days with our Alaska Sea Ice program. Weather.gov/Anchorage/ice is a place to go there. Everything you see here in blue is concentrations from at least 0 to about 80%. So there's still plenty of ice in navigational waters, and be careful out there, and again, seek guidance before you go. Here's a look at what's going on in southeast, and southerlies coming up through the Lynn Canal up to 15 knots in the northern part of the canal with 3-foot seas. Otherwise, light winds the further south you go toward the Clarence Strait. Across the outer coast, winds will be around 10 to 15 knots, more of a westerly push from Sitka southward toward the Dixon entrance on 7-foot seas on Friday. And that'll become more northwesterly along the outer coast on Saturday, with seas holding between 5 and 6 feet. Southerlies continue in the Lynn Canal, and winds remain generally light in the inner channels, anywhere from 10 to 15 knots. 3-foot seas there in the Clarence Strait as we get into Saturday. For South Central, look for a light and variable flow in just about all areas. More of a southwesterly flow east of the Barren Islands with a 6-foot sea, 7-foot seas east of Kodiak Island, and small seas in Cook Inlet and Shelikof Strait, as well as Prince William Sound. By Saturday, though, we start to get into a more of a southwesterly influence, and that's going to pick up speed as well. 20 to 25 knots coming up Cook Inlet, Shelikof Strait, and west of the Barrens. You're looking for seas anywhere from 5 to 7-foot seas in those areas. Still small seas and light winds inside of Prince William Sound. In the north and western Gulf, 15 to 20 knots with 5-foot seas in all areas on Saturday. In Bristol Bay, a southeasterly wind there, 10 knots with a 2-foot sea. Otherwise, 15 knots across the North Pacific, and from Cape Sarachev to Port Hayden, looking for 4-foot seas there on a 15-knot wind from the west, 15 knots as well in the North Pacific. For Saturday, a southwesterly wind picks up, just as we saw in the last chart. Southwesterlies from 30 knots or so across the Bering Sea coast, 8 to 9 foot seas there, and 6 foot seas across the Pacific coast, 15 to 20 knots expected as you head from Castle Cape all the way out toward False Pass. Across the Aleutians, winds around 15 to 20 knots or so on Friday. You're looking at west to southwesterlies across the western chain, 6 to 8 foot seas there, and anywhere from 5 to 8 foot seas from Adak out toward Unalaska, 4 to 6 foot seas from Adak to Unalaska on the Pacific coast side on 15 to 20 knot winds, becoming more northwesterly there on Friday, and then returning to that southwesterly flow as we get into Saturday, 25 to 30 knots all areas, looking for 9 to 10 foot seas from Adak out toward Shemya, and then west and southwesterlies there with 7 to 8 foot seas on the Pacific and Bering Sea coast, generally again from the west and southwest, 25 to 30 for Saturday. For Friday, a broad southwesterly flow will take charge of the Bering Sea, 25 knots, especially in the northern Bering with 6 to 8 foot seas there, 3 to 4 foot seas from the Kuskokwim Delta all the way out toward the Pribilofs, where you'll see a 15 knot wind on Friday. For Saturday, we hold on to that southwesterly flow. It picks up a little bit more for St. Paul, St. George, and the Kuskokwim coastline, all the way up toward Macoriac, 25 to 30 with 8 to 10 foot seas. A little bit more of a westerly change here around the St. Matthew Island waters on a 20 knot wind, but we hold on to those southwesterlies from St. Lawrence to areas north of Etolan Strait and north of Nunivak Island, and that'll keep those higher waves coming ashore, especially for southwest-facing coastlines there, so 8 to 9 foot seas in the north. Across the north slope, westerlies to northwesterly winds for the Beaufort Sea coast. Again, that could bring a little bit of ice closer to home. Easterlies moving off the Chukchi coast, following the front, 15 to 20, 3 to 4 foot seas there, but we'll keep those southwesterlies around the Kotzebue Sound region at 30 knots with an 8 foot sea. As we get into Saturday, there's that next northerly push. North and northeasterly winds developing along the Chukchi coast, 20 to 25, northerlies from Cape Lisburn down to Point Hope. We'll hold on to the southwesterly flow inside of Kotzebue Sound, and southerlies working from Prudhoe Bay, Dead Horse, and Kaktovik northward with 6 to 5 foot seas there as you head further eastward on Saturday. Recapping tonight's weather, it's going to be pretty wet across the central and western Brooks Range. 2 to 4 inches of rain is possible. A lot of that will probably drain into the upper Kobuk and Noatak valleys. So if you're in those areas, be mindful of the streams and rivers heading out to sea. Rainfall also focusing in parts of central and northern southeast as we go into Friday. Rainfall continues up north as well into the weekend. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Alyeska Pipeline Service Company, fueling philanthropic programs and dedicated to creating educational and professional opportunities for Alaska Native people.